Okay, this week we're dealing with discrimination. And so what I want to do is just do a brief overview of the topic and introduce the paper and give some suggestions about how to operate through this week's assignments. So first off, I want to distinguish discrimination as a concept between prejudice and between racism. So prejudice is pre-existing beliefs. So prejudice is sort of if I believe in stereotypes about people, or if I assume something about somebody before knowing anything about them, that would be considered a prejudice. Discrimination is behaviors that are treating people differently on the basis of a pre-existing belief. So if I have prejudice and then also treat people differently on the basis of that belief, then that would be considered discrimination. That's different than when we're talking about racism, because racism is a whole system and structure that is in place that impacts people whether or not they're behaving in discriminating ways, whether or not they have strongly held prejudices, whether or not they're working to abolish prejudices in themselves, whether or not they're working to move against discrimination. Racism is sort of a superstructure that exists on top of everything else that is happening. So when we talk about discrimination, usually the way that we have done so in economics is through that individual level. So our ontology is at the individual level. Individual people are making decisions. Individual people have prejudices. Individual people are treating people differently on the basis of those prejudices. What the article we're looking at today, or this week, is talking about is stratification economics, which is a fairly new genre of economics. And what it does is a couple of things, but what you'll notice is that when we were talking about ontology, like, are there individuals, are there classes, are there whole institutions? Stratification economics takes the class, by which I don't mean like income level, I mean group of people. It takes that group of people and counts sort of their well-being as one. So, which is to say, it acknowledges that there are groups of people that sort of band together for an assortment of reasons. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as I get into the article. But all to say that the difference in the way that the discipline of economics deals with discrimination is that traditionally, economics has dealt with discrimination as the case as of one individual treating another individual poorly. Stratification economics takes wisdom from all other disciplines and acknowledges that discriminatory behavior happens in a larger social context, and usually, and actually pretty intensely requires the belief of membership to a particular group in order to function. By believing the membership of a particular group, we identify others and then treat the others differently. So treating the others differently on the basis of assumed beliefs is that discriminatory pattern. Okay. Pause here. Write down any questions that you have. Throw them in the discussion board later or now. Okay. So now I'm going to introduce the article written by Kyle Moore, who's a colleague of mine, is one of these sort of like, as one of these frontiering minds on stratification economics. If you remember the TED Talk we watched about baby bonds with Sandy Darity, he also he's one of the founding minds of stratification economics. And the article that we're reading this week deals specifically with Black and white Americans and persistent differences in outcomes for these two groups of people. It can be used for other races. It can be used for ethnicities. It can be used for gender. The way that we write the story might be a little bit different, but the same technique can be applied in different forms of discrimination. But we're just looking at it in this one particular context, which is not to say that discrimination doesn't happen in a host of other places, but to look at the way this type of economics functions differently than other types of economics. We're just going to look at this one particular slice. Okay. And inside of this one particular slice, we're just looking at differences in income, wealth, education, and health. That's the way that this article works. So I'm going to share that screen with you. Okay, there we go. So this is our article for this week. We're observing that we have a disparity, right? A disparity, which is to say we have a difference in outcomes between Black and white America. There have been, in general, 3 different types of explanations: genetic, cultural, and structural. This genetic one we're not talking about. It's mostly fallen out of favor, even though it has come back, right? This is exactly what Kyle's saying right here. But this genetic explanation for why there are persistent differences between Black and white Americans, he's referring to eugenics in that case. So he doesn't deal with it because it's a discredited theory, so we don't need it. Also, that just to point out that people can continue to use discredited theories to back up their points, even when they have no place. Okay, so that's that. The cultural explanation is going to be that neoclassical explanation, and the structural is going to be the stratification economics. So the cultural explanation comes on the neoclassical class. So if you remember Ha-Joon Chang talking about 9 different schools of economic thought, he talked about the free market economists, and that was the classicals, the neoclassicals, and the Austrians. And the neoclassicals are the dominant framework. So for as long as there has been a group of a discipline that has called itself economics, the neoclassicals have been in the dominant sphere since mid-20th century. And so when you talk to economists about discrimination, those cultural explanations are still the things that they have in the back of their mind, even though other disciplines in the social sciences have largely discredited most of those cultural explanations. Stratification economics seeks to provide another economics-based explanation that is rooted in how we understand group-based behavior in actual fact, rather than just theories and postulating, making assumptions about other people. Essentially, prejudiced economics is what we have had to deal with, and now we have this new kind that's actually based in what really happens. It's based in looking at real statistics, so we don't have to make assumptions about how people behave. We can just look at how people behave. Right. Okay. Pause there. If there's any questions, if you can figure out what I just said and rewrite that in the discussion board, that would count as a post. That would be great. I think very helpful. To be a moment in class, can someone just tell me what I just said? Tell me what I just said. Okay. You can rewind in this version of my lecture, so that might be a good way to go. Okay, so I'm not going to go as slowly through the entire article. I just want to outlay this first part. So when he talks about income and he talks about Gary Becker's also wrote about households and husbands and wives and the way labor was divided in the household, which is, amusing. And also, up until not that long ago, was the basis of the way economists thought about the differences between men and women. But we're leaving that aside for now. So Gary Becker writes The Economics of Discrimination. And what he essentially says is that employers who discriminate on hiring will be doing their businesses a disservice because they're not hiring the best people. they're hiring the people who look like them, right? So if white employers are only hiring white employees and they're not hiring any black employees, then then they're going to do poorly, because those the those potential employees are going to find other places to work, and since they're better than the white people that just sort of rolled up, these other businesses are going to do better and run them out of the water. So discriminating employers should go out of business in the long run, and we should see a just general, gentle convergence towards equality over time. That is not what we have seen. So our statistics don't support that this is what is happening in the background. And so, 20 years, 15 years later, Kenneth Arrow has another idea, and that is that um, it's a paper that, well, here, we're looking at two different potential employees. Educational attainment is one signal employers might rely on to make these predictions about what employments there are. But according to this theory of statistical discrimination, employers tend to believe that Black educational attainment is a noisier signal than white educational attainment. Which is to say that if I look at a degree between a Black and a white potential employee, employers don't know what that means for Black potential employees, right? That's one explanation, which in and of itself is a prejudice, right? This is describing a prejudice. So it's basically just saying that employers are prejudiced. Or the other problem is that Black workers are in general either less productive or less reliably productive than white workers, which again is another prejudice, right? So because they have less information, because they have less Black employees, they make adverse assumptions about their potential employees. So this explanation is essentially that white employers are discriminating, right? Because they think it's what's best for them. What is the value added of this? I mean, it doesn't provide a reason, really. It just says, it just sort of, it's an economist way of describing what discrimination is. Moving forward in the history of economics, there have been a number of explanations, and I'll let Kyle describe them, that are based on beliefs about the values between Black and white America, but they're beliefs about the differences in values of Black and white America as written by white economists who have not spent a whole lot of time outside of engaging with their own race. So the other explanations are also in and of themselves prejudices, right? Okay, so that's where economics has been, not too glamorous or esteemable. So by contrast, we have this stratification economics, and stratification economics, I'm going to let Kyle explain it because he does an excellent job of writing clearly. But what it does is stratification economics seeks to do what the cultural explanation of discrimination could not do, and that is describe why white employers would have an incentive to discriminate against Black employees and people of color in general. We see sort of, and this is sort of the theme throughout all these four, income, wealth, education, and health, is that there is a history of neoclassical economics providing prejudiced descriptions for why discrimination happens, and stratification economics as dipping into those other disciplines, dipping into real, actual experience of Black Americans, and describing what actually happens. So here, let me stop the share now and pause for a second. Okay, so one thing that stratification economics helps to explain is why white employers would persistently engage in behavior that we know to be counterproductive, right? Why would they not hire the best person for the job? So other disciplines are better at explaining this than economics is. But what stratification economics offers is this idea of, by having a race-based group of belonging, white people create a buffer for themselves. So the best way to see that in the American economy, or one way to see that in the American economy, is that regardless of whether we're in a recession or in a boom where people in general are employed and doing pretty well, the Black unemployment rate is usually about twice that of the white unemployment rate. So what that means is, by behaving in discriminatory ways, white employers make sure that when there is a recession, that they don't take that group doesn't take the brunt of the recession. So if there's a downfall in the economy, then what the white group does is like insulate itself by being discriminatory against other groups. So that even though that might mean that the productivity of that enterprise in and of itself might go down, those white people get to feel safer in that they will not lose their job because somebody else is going to take the hit first. And this is like well documented in other like social justice communities and in other disciplines. But then this description allows us to understand a particular economic incentive for why white people would behave that way, even though it should make their enterprises less efficient overall. Now, that said, that does not mean that the best thing for white people to do is to like just screw over everybody else, for an assortment of reasons. And right, this comes back to like our claim making situation. Like, we can have all kinds of reasons, premises for why we're making a particular argument. So we can have a social justice or human rights based lens, which will have a different one. But even if we take an instrumental lens and we're talking about economic outcomes and we just want to find the best economic outcome, even if we don't care about human rights, we can still say that there are other lenses that allow us to see beyond that throwing each other under the bus scenario. So if you think broader, so as individuals, we make discriminatory decisions. As groups, we make discriminatory decisions. If we think as a class of people who are working together, that class of workers will have better economic outcomes if it can unite. But you'll see, like, even inside trade unions, that there is often a lot of, not always, but there's often a history of discrimination, especially across race and gender within different industries. So we have a whole trade union all together, we're working together, but the people at the top are white men, or we aren't listening to the complaints of people of color, or we're not listening to the complaints of women because it's inconvenient for the people who are pulling the reins to have that many demands. I would rather have less demands and get their immediate needs met inside a whole class-based structure, even when it gets wider. Great. So in some, like, this is well documented in other disciplines, stratification economics is the attempt inside of economics to explain that type of behavior. Okay, so pause there. How does stratification economics explain persistent discriminatory behavior? despite the fact that it is not in the economic best interest of anyone. So that would be one thing to throw into the discussion board. So that's sort of the whole thing. Um, so now when you're writing, so every week, right, we have a response paper and we have a discussion board. So the response paper, just like any other week, find one argument. I mean, I already gave you it's clear whose side I'm rooting for at this point, but find an argument in there, explain it on its own terms, and agree or disagree. When you agree or disagree, tell me why. You can use other information inside of it. So I might say, Gary Becker explained discrimination this way. I disagree because, as Kyle explains later, stratification economics adds all these other elements to it that can't be accounted for inside of Gary Becker's explanation, for instance, right? Okay, so that's like normal, but keep in mind that as you're doing it, you don't need to explain for the whole thing, right? You just need to summarize one point. You don't need to explain income and wealth and education and health, just one thing and one little part inside of there. Article is a little bit longer, but the language is clear. So take your time with it, or give yourself time for it. Okay, so that's the response paper. And then the other thing that I want to just make sure that you know where this is. So here's our Blackboard page. If I go over here on this left-hand side, over here, what? Oh, that's why. Everything's gone. I just want this part. Go over here on the left-hand side, announcements, course information, yada, yada, yada. I'm gonna go to this discussion boards. And right, this is kind of grayed out right now. But here, this is for week 11, so this is discrimination. Please respond to one. Please respond to. Please respond to one or more of the following questions or ask one of your own. What questions do you have about discrimination? What do you think can be done to stop discrimination? What are some places or organizations that you're aware of that have taken effective steps? Are there aspects of the neoclassical economics arguments that are useful for discussing disparities between Black and white communities? Or ask another question of your own. So the way this is set up is that each week, here's 11, 10, 8, 9, 8 and 7, right? 9 was review, so we didn't really have one for that. But for week 7 and onward, ever since we got back from the quarantine, we have a discussion board. I've asked that everybody make 2 posts each week. Those posts can be a question. Those posts can be part of your response paper. Those questions they can be an answer to one of these questions. They can be an answer to a question that one of your classmates posed. If you respond to one, that's 80% for that week. If you make a second response, that's 100% for that week. The only requirement is that it's relevant. There's no length requirement. It doesn't need to be like right. It can be an opinion. This is because we don't have in-class time. So we don't get a chance to like engage with ideas. So this is where you get to go to like write things that are not totally complete. If you have an idea, but you don't know how to back it up, put it in here. You can respond to each other. And yeah, as long as it is relevant, then you get that point and that credit. This is to try and like, yeah, boost up that space. If you're having trouble accessing it for any reason, please let me know. I can't know that unless you tell me. So that's where that is. And then remember, I'm time traveling right now, so it's not here yet, but all of this course materials are in their folders. So in week 11, right, that's gonna have this article, it's gonna have this video, and it's gonna have that discussion board, okay? And that's in the right course materials there. If you're looking for where you need to put your response paper, it's an assignment. So it's over here in assignments, right? So when I click on reading response 11, um, oh, if I go, yeah, if I click on reading response 11, then there'll be a place for me to submit my reading response there. And make sure you submit it. Some people are saving their responses, but not like clicking all the way through on submit. Um, so it doesn't, so I'm not getting access to it. So make sure that you get it all the way through. Um, Remember also I have office hours on Tuesdays. If you want to talk about anything, just send me an email if you can't make it to office hours. Okay, that's all I have for you this week. Uh, be well, and I'll talk to you later. Okay, thank you.